Hello and a very warm welcome to British Guy Reacts. It is so great to have you. Now I'm going to react to the Russian Revolution Oversimplified Part 2. So I did Part 1 a couple of weeks ago. So Part 1 covered the 1905 revolution, which was sort of a semi-successful. I mean, it led to some reforms, but most of that was rolled back. It covered the Menshevik-Bolshevik split, the Bolsheviks obviously being the people who would eventually take power in October 1917. It covered Count Stolypin's reform attempts, which didn't really work, and Count Stolypin ended up getting assassinated. So basically, we're starting right at just before World War I began, and Lenin is sitting in a Swiss cafe with a bunch of other Bolsheviks arguing with each other and not achieving very much. But that's going to change. So let's play the video. Part 2.
While Nicholas had been busy playing with his new best friend, tensions
Rasputin
in Europe had been rising. It just so happened that in 1914, one Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary went for a drive with the top down in Sarajevo.
Yeah.
One thing leads to another.
Again, I think this is from the same shot from the other video, but I love how long that guy's arms is. I mean, no wonder they chose him as the assassin. I mean, he could hardly fucking miss, could he?
And suddenly Russia found itself at war with half of Europe. A wave of patriotism swept through Russia. The capital was renamed to Petrograd because St. Petersburg sounded a bit too German.
Yeah, that's about this. I mean, it's curious how that city kept changing its names. It went from St. Petersburg to Petrograd to Leningrad. But on a more kind of practical level, I mean, all across Europe, you can see the kind of how the First World War damaged kind of cultural exchange. So, I mean, in the UK, the surname of the British royal family was something along the lines of Saxon-Gothenburg. It was something very Germanic, but that got changed to the much more British-sounding Windsor, because once the First World War started, it became a bit awkward to be called Saxon-Gothenburg. So you can see just how culturally interconnected Europe was and how that got frayed and undermined once the war began.
Even revolutionaries were getting on board. To them, World War I was a big stinky imperialist war, but they didn't want their big stinky imperialist replaced by a foreign one. So pretty much everyone wanted Russia to win. I hope Russia loses. Jeez, read the room, Lenin. Lenin hoped Russia would lose because that would help him overthrow the Tsar.
So this was Lenin's policy of revolutionary defeatism, the idea that the most progressive outcome is a Russian military defeat in the hope that will provoke a Russian revolution. It's really interesting how all across Europe, as this video said, or implied, socialist movements, which before the war had been and these were quite powerful movements. So in Germany, the SPD, the Social Democrats, was by far the biggest party. Before the war, they'd all been coordinating with each other, discussing how to stop what they regarded as an imperialist capitalist war, mass strikes, that kind of thing. Once the war actually began, most of them fell in behind their governments. So crucially, most importantly, the German SPD voted for the Kaiser's war credits. And with just a handful of exceptions, Lenin being, a few remained neutral, and a tiny number like Lenin actively rooted against their own country, basically.
As long as he did that, who cares if Germany blows up half the country? And blow up half the country, they did.
Yes.
An inefficient czarist government meant there were shortages of just about everything you need to fight a war.
Fabergé eggs. You can earn some with Fabergé eggs. They look pretty painful. I could gave someone a good knock with them.
And if losing a teensy-weensy war with Japan upset the people, losing a giant wide war like this was much worse. Soldiers were deserting, the economy was imploding, and in no time, Russia was starving. The peasants were getting more peasanty, the workers were getting more workery, all the while Germany was getting more Germanery. We need to win this war. I need someone with a great military mind to step in and take control. You're right. How about General Hickenlooper? How about me? You can't run the war. Who'll be in charge of the country while you're gone? Obviously, my German wife and a homeless wizard. Duh. Nicholas declared himself commander-in-chief and went to the front lines, leaving his...
It's a complete mystery how the Tsar was overthrown. It makes no sense whatsoever. He made no mistakes at all. He was a perfect reign.
German wife in charge while they were fighting, the Germans. It wasn't a good look. And because Alexander was so close to Rasputin, people believed that he was actually calling the shots and secretly destroying Russia, and maybe even boinking her. An even worser look. At this point, a bunch of nobles just couldn't take it anymore. Rasputin is destroying the country. We have to break his magic spell over the Tsar. But how? He's magic.
Yeah, that totally would have worked. Rasputin's sexual exploits. A lot of Rasputin's character has been exaggerated, but that bit seems to be genuinely true.
Dude, very cool. Hey, it's Rasputin. The sexy party is running a little late, but in the meantime, why don't you try one of these totally not poisoned cakes? Dude, why'd you say it like that? He's totally gonna know they're poisoned now. Shut up! I said they're not poisoned. Dude, he just ate so much poison. How is he still alive? It must be the magic. Go with plan B. Is he dead?
No.
See, Boris? I told you.
So there's this crazy story about the death of Rasputin. I mean, it's probably not true. It just doesn't seem plausible. But it's based partly on the account of one of the aristocrats who was involved in his assassination. So basically, he was invited to a noble's home. And he turned up there, and as the video said, he was poisoned. So they gave him poison cake, poison wine. That didn't kill him, so then they shot him. At this point, they thought he was dead. They left the room. They came back in, and he was not just not dead, but he had physically assaulted on them. So then they shot him again, and then eventually they threw him into an ice river where some say he was still alive when he got thrown into the ice river and he actually drowned. Now, firstly, I'm very skeptical about that story because it just doesn't seem plausible, but it is a great story. So let's go with it.
He was the Antichrist, and you didn't believe me. Can you shut up for 1 minute and help me roll him up?
Yeah.
Are you sure
So
he's dead?
that's-
I don't know, but I'm supposed to be hosting a charity auction right now. Can we get this over with?
I think they found his body below the ice. And one kind of interesting thing is that one of the big problems for the Russian elite, the Tsar system, was it was far too elitist. You had it was almost entirely reliant on the aristocracy. And Rasputin was from a genuinely very poor background. He was a peasant in origin. It's very ironic that one of the relationships that most screwed the Tsar up wasn't a relationship with a noble. It was a relationship with a peasant, who arguably the Tsar should have been having more to do with other social classes.
Okay, now he's dead. The murder of Rasputin, just like his life, is shrouded in mystery and speculation. He probably didn't really die like that, but he also probably didn't really heal them. He probably didn't influence the Tsar as much as people thought. He probably wasn't secretly destroying the country. But what he definitely did do, even in his death, was ruin the Tsar's reputation. Russia's autocracy looked more outdated than ever, and the Russian people were taking notice. Come on, men. Remember what we're fighting for.
Yeah,
Yeah, no.
I
We're
can
out.
see that.
World War I
So-
left Russia broke, hungry, and exhausted. And with Nicholas acting as commander-in-chief, he was getting even more blame. For the second time, Russia was on the brink of revolution.
So
By
there were three
1917, Russia had been
revolutions.
fighting a war it couldn't afford for 3 years. They were running out of many things, most worryingly, food. On International Women's Day, 1917, thousands of hungry women in Petrograd were so sick of being hungry that they took to the streets. And it turns out it's
I can
not just
understand.
women who experience hunger, but men too. So the next day they joined in as well. Gatherings on the streets were forbidden, but I'm not sure how you'd arrest 250,000 people. The crowds demanded an end to the war.
That's always so. The key to overthrowing any dictatorship is breaking through that initial barrier of fear. Because once you have a certain critical mass, it's very difficult for the regime to get rid of them. So if you look at the Arab Spring, I mean, any of the successful revolutions, once you get to a critical mass, you've got a decent chance of overthrowing the regime. The problem is for the first few thousand people who protest, it's incredibly dangerous. And if no one joins them, they're kind of screwed. So it's a big gamble.
An end to food rationing, and even an end to the Tsar's autocracy. Now, normally,
So I mean, this would later lead to the famous Bolshevik slogan, "Bread, Peace, Land," which was, I mean, devastatingly effective. It kind of perfectly encapsulated what much of the Russian population wanted.
the troops would deal with this kind of thing. But as it turns out, soldiers get hungry too, and they were also tired of having to kill their fellow Russians so much. So entire regiments mutinied in the capital, and they joined the crowd as well,
I knew
trashing
them,
symbols
yeah.
of the Tsar and his autocratic regime. Things were escalating very quickly. Liberal politicians watching the riots in the streets had long been dissatisfied with the Tsar, since he would shut their parliament down anytime they did something he didn't like. They believed the only way to bring stability back to the streets was for Nicholas II to abdicate.
Yeah.
The riots continued. The police
So in classic Marxist terms, this would be the Bourgeois Revolution. I mean, the Mensheviks especially thought in classic Marxist terms. The Bolsheviks had a slightly different interpretation. But this would be the Bourgeois Revolution, which then leads to rapid industrialization, which then leads to the Proletarian Revolution.
fired on soldiers.
Or the workers'
Soldiers
revolution.
fired on soldiers. The workers re-established the Petrograd Soviet. Politicians began arresting the Tsar's ministers. He may have been an autocrat, but he just lost complete control of his capital city. Talk about embarrassing. Nicholas, the troops have turned against us. The people have taken over the city. They've even cut my phone line. Hello? Hello? The phones are down. Things must be bad.
The banana. As someone who's been without a phone for a couple of days, I can sympathise greatly with the struggles of Tsar Nicholas. So if you're watching, well, obviously you're not, but if any of Tsar Nicholas' family are watching, I know what your man went through.
I'd better go back
Sort
there.
of.
Nicholas hopped on the next train back to Petrograd, but he never made it to the city. His train was met by military generals and other politicians. What's going on? Nicholas, look man, we need to talk. It's not you, it's us. Who am I kidding? No, it's definitely you. During the whole crisis in Petrograd, the liberals convinced the generals that if Nicholas abdicated, the people would calm down, and the generals were on board. They didn't have time to quell the chaos, because don't forget, they were still losing a global, all-encompassing war against the Germans. And with the military no longer on his side, Nicholas had no choice but to step down. Throughout his entire reign, he had done everything he could to keep all the power for himself, and in the end, that's exactly what left him with none. But then there was a big question. Who would replace Nicholas? Well, his son Alexei was next in line. Hey buddy, Daddy couldn't handle the complex socioeconomic problems of a giant multinational, multi-ethnic empire that's engaged in total war with all of Europe. You think you could give it a shot?
So, the blood is a reference. His son had a rare blood disorder, basically meant he wouldn't stop bleeding, and Rasputin was brought in, and in some way, the Tsar and Tsarina became convinced that Rasputin had partially cured him, which is why they fell in love with the guy so much.
Alexei just wasn't ready to be Tsar. Nicholas did have a brother, but given the state of the empire, he wasn't keen either. And so,
Understandable.
300 years of Romanov rule in Russia just kind of came to an end. The earlier 1905 revolution hadn't changed much, but this new revolution had left Russia without a Tsar. And still, before the year was over, there would be one more revolution left to come.
Yeah, the big
Nicholas's
one.
failure as commander of the armed forces was the final straw that broke the
decisive.
camel's back. Now where was I? Oh yeah. Hungry woman, absolute chaos, and the end of the Tsar. Oh, hey guys, says here there's been a revolution, and the reign of the Tsars has ended. Oh, come on, I missed an...
I love that capitalism by Karl Marx.
Another one? Why am I even in this video? Well, it's not like you could have done anything. As long as there's a world war, you can't get back to Russia. Who wants to start a revolution? Despite getting rid of Nick, Russia was still at war with half of Europe. The Germans, however, had an idea. They thought that if they helped Lenin get back, he would cause trouble for the new Russian government. So they put him on a train. Destination, Petrograd. It was a long journey. And
so, I mean, the new Russian government, the kind of provisional government, did a lot of liberalising, and it freed political prisoners. It allowed people like Lenin to come back from exile. I mean, some people argue it was too tolerant, but if they'd been a lot tougher on the people who wanted to overthrow them, they might actually have survived. Although, I mean, how much that's actually true, I'm not sure. But I mean, the Germans. So that, as this video said, they put Lenin and other leading Bolsheviks on a famously sealed train and took them all the way across to Russia. Essentially, from the German point of view, they were kind of implanting an anti-war virus into the Russian body politic. And as it turns out, it was incredibly successful. It was a stunningly successful move. One train changed the course of history.
While Lenin was cooped up in his train, things in Russia were changing. Workers were taking control of their factories.
Yes.
Soldiers were socking it to their mean old officers. Without a czar, a big old power vacuum had opened up, and someone needed to fill it. The liberals proposed they be in charge, and they set up the Provisional government. The workers, however, had already begun establishing local Soviets, largely controlled by the social revolutionaries and the Mensheviks.
So the social revolutionaries were basically the peasants' party, and they had their ideology in. I mean, they were socialists, but their ideology was very much rooted in the peasantry. And the Mensheviks were much more conventional Marxists, so they're a little bit more moderate than the Bolsheviks, but that's a bit simplistic. Oh, the guy that's, I mean, so the Petrograd Soviet essentially became almost like a second government. I mean, initially it supported the provisional government, usually, but it became pretty clear that the provisional government couldn't get much done without the Petrograd Soviet being on board. And so you had this kind of dual power situation, which caused chaos. Also, it didn't help that the provisional government was initially led by some quite aristocratic people. So Prince Lvov was the first guy to head it. And the fact he's got a prince in his name kind of tells you all you need to know about it. So, It's a very unstable situation.
Bolsheviks. And since neither felt like they had the power to oust the other, Russia ended up in a classic dual power conundrum. The two coexisted, with the provisional government becoming the official government, and the elected Soviets issuing orders to the workers and soldiers. This power balance was delicate, and all it would take is one bold revolutionary to come along and give everyone a big-brained beatdown. Oh boy, Lenin's coming home. I can't wait for him to see all the great things we've accomplished, and I'm gonna show him my fan art. Oh look, here he comes now. Shut up! You all suck! The provisional government sucks, the Soviet sucks, even your fan art sucks!
So this pretty much happened, I mean, minus the fan art bit. So this was, I think, Finland station at Petrograd. Lenin got back, and some of the Bolsheviks initially were kind of okay with the provisional government. They thought it was a step in the right direction. They were tolerating it. And Lenin came back and said, absolutely not. We are going to fight the provisional government. We need a workers' revolution. This is not good enough. And that from that point on, the Bolsheviks became fiercely opposed to them.
Why does he have to be so mean? In case you couldn't tell, Lenin wasn't a fan of everything that had been happening. In his April theses, he called the provisional government and the Soviets a bunch of big bourgeois bozos. And he kind of had a point. There was still a lot for the Russian people to be mad about. The provisional government hadn't got Russia out of the war, the people were still hungry, and the peasants were still hoping to get more land. Meanwhile, the Soviets hadn't done much to change things either, but even though they weren't perfect, a lot of people did like what the new government had been doing. There was progress. The secret police were disbanded, the death penalty abolished. They even planned to hold elections, meaning for the first time ever, the Russian people could choose their own government. To many, Lenin seemed like some out-of-touch weirdo. If Lenin wanted to go from whiny irrelevant zero to hunky communist hero, he'd need to shake things up a bit. So he and the Bolsheviks came up with a hot new slogan that promised to give the people what the provisional government wouldn't. Peace. Don't like war? We'll end it. Land. You want land? We'll give it to you.
And the land thing was basically an appeal to the peasantry. So that was the, as we said earlier, it was the big base of support for the socialist revolutionaries. Because since the abolition of serfdom, I mean, peasants, whilst they were no longer serfs, I mean, serfs are pretty much slaves. They were basically property of their landlord. Whilst they were all the nobility, whilst that had been ended, they still had to pay extortionate rents on the land. And so the big peasant demand was that the land is confiscated from landowners and given to them, which the Bolsheviks promised to do.
Bread. Hungry. Scooby-Dooby-Doo.
Yeah.
Lenin also called for all power to the Soviets, which meant getting rid of the provisional government and having the Soviets run the place. A communist dream. The people liked these slogans, and bit by bit, the Bolsheviks became more popular. Some Mensheviks even began switching sides. But even though the people thought Lenin...
Yeah, I mean, Trotsky's a confusing one. So he kind of sided with the Mensheviks during the Bolshevik-Menshevik split. He wasn't a pure Menshevik. He was actually part of kind of his own faction. So there was a very small minor faction. Anyway, as the video says, he ended up throwing his lot in with the Bolsheviks and would prove pretty decisive.
Slogans rocked. As long as the provisional government didn't mess up, they'd continue to support it. So let's check in on the provisional government. Oh, provisional government.
Yeah.
You've made a big mess. The provisional government lasted for just 9 months, but those 9 months were chaos. The people wanted Russia out of World War I, but Minister of War Alexander Kerensky thought instead of doing that, why not do the exact opposite? If the people saw more Russian victories, they'd have to support the new government, and that went just about as well as you might expect. These heavy defeats worsened the Russian economy.
The Kerensky Offensive started very well for the Russians, but it got bogged down very, very quickly and then ended up getting pushed right back, and it was a total humiliation.
And made the hungry people hungrier. And by now, I think you know what comes next. They trashed the place.
Yes.
More looting, more rioting, more violence. It was like the Tsar had never abdicated. Tens of thousands of armed workers took to the streets during some of the worst violence Petrograd had seen yet. And in response, Kerensky called in the troops, who opened fire on the demonstrators. For now, Lenin and other Bolshevik leaders wanted to distance themselves from the violence, but the crowds marched under Bolshevik slogans, and as a result, Kerensky, now the prime minister, took the opportunity to stamp down on the Bolsheviks. Their leaders were arrested. Lenin was accused of being a German agent, and he was forced to flee to Finland in disguise. This sucked!
So there was, this video kind of says that the Bolsheviks weren't involved, and that seems to be broadly true. It seemed that the pressure from during the July Days crisis, the pressure from below was pushing the Bolsheviks in more radical. But there certainly were Bolsheviks who were saying we should seize power at this time, and that was kind of what the government used as an excuse to crack down on them. Although obviously not enough that they completely suppressed the movement.
Now Now I'll never get to have my revolution. Why are you wearing a dress? It's a disguise, idiot.
Judgmental.
And it makes me feel pretty. Kerensky had successfully dealt with the violence, but he just couldn't catch a break. This increasing support for more extreme forms of socialism, along with the poor handling of the war, alarmed traditional liberals and bougie business boys. To appease them, Kerensky decided to promote a military legend to Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces, someone who hated the revolution, loved the death penalty, and was devoutly anti-socialist, General Kornilov. Hey man, thanks for the promotion. That was real swell of you. Of course, with you by my side, who would dare try to overthrow me? How about me?
Yes.
I did not see this coming. Unfortunately for Kerensky, Kornilov hated the liberal and socialist reforms of the new government, particularly the dumb socialist soldiers' committees. The army was no place for undisciplined left-wing snowflakes. Fearing a Bolshevik takeover was imminent, Kornilov ordered his men towards Petrograd to oust the Soviet and take over. Kerensky freaked out, and he needed help. Since he knew Trotsky was finger-licking good at organizing, he and other Bolshevik leaders were released, and they, along with the Soviet, organized the defense of Petrograd. Kornilov had the power of...
So, I mean, the kind of key outcome of the Kornilov Offensive was the Soviets became armed, the workers' committees became armed. Because the Bolsheviks seized power via the Petrograd Soviet and via other Soviets in different cities. They didn't just seize power on behalf of themselves. They claimed to be acting on behalf of the Petrograd and Moscow Soviets, which they controlled. They ended up with a majority on them. So it was at this point that they started getting really substantial quantities of weapons because they were given to the workers, and they viewed they might have to fight off a right-wing coup.
Soldiers, but the Soviet had the power of workers, and they did what workers do best. Railroad workers diverted Kornilov's men away. Telegraph workers messed with his communications. They even infiltrated his forces and encouraged the demoralized men to desert.
Steve,
They were also
famously
armed en
Russian
masse,
name.
but in the end, no fighting was necessary because Kornilov's coup just fell apart, and Kornilov was sent straight to prison. Everything was coming up Kerensky. Hey, thanks for the help, boys. Couldn't have done it without you. Now that there's no longer any threat, how about you, return all those guns I gave you?
Yes.
No. Oh, no.
I can see where we're coming
Kerensky had
from.
just given a gun to a bear. A Bolshevik bear. The whole affair was a huge propaganda win for them. They had defended the revolution, and their popularity skyrocketed. They found themselves elected to the Petrograd and Moscow Soviets, with Trotsky even becoming...
So, even though, the video quite correctly says that the Bolsheviks became far more popular, but that's still got to be within a certain context. Their popularity was very limited and concentrated within certain social groups. So that they had a lot of popularity in the cities. They got majorities on the Moscow and Petrograd Soviets. They were quite popular in the armed forces, but their support within the peasantry, the mass of the population, was not non-existent, but still behind the socialist revolutionaries. And we know that because when finally the elections to the Constitutional Assembly eventually happened, the Bolsheviks lost, and the Bolsheviks responded by closing down the Constitutional Assembly. So as the video says, the Bolsheviks are getting more popular, but what matters is they have popularity where it counts. They have popularity in the military and in the big cities, and that's kind of where Russian politics get determined, not in the middle of nowhere in Siberia where the socialist revolutionaries might have their support.
Chairman in Petrograd. They were now in a very powerful position, almost powerful enough for Lenin to return home from Finland and finally stage his long-awaited communist revolution. The Bolsheviks began planning their takeover of the Russian government. Some got cold feet and began arguing.
So if you study Soviet history, I've only know the very basics, but so Zinoviev and Kamenev are in basically every debate they take the same side of every confrontation, even against Stalin. It was Zinoviev and Kamenev took exactly the same position. So yeah, if you write one of them down in your kind of history exam, you can generally write them both down, and they both were executed by Stalin. So quite sad.
Arguing against Lenin's armed revolution in favor of a more peaceful approach, and they even wrote newspaper articles about it, which kind of gave the whole scheme away. The Bolsheviks are planning an armed revolution.
And that was used against them
once. I did not see this coming. Kerensky began arresting Bolsheviks, and as a result, Lenin and the boys felt they had no choice but to commence the revolution right now. Lenin was back in Petrograd, but was still in hiding, so Trotsky got the ball rolling, using his position as Soviet chairman to organize the Bolshevik militias. Now, if you were to ask Soviet artists, the revolution went something like this.
Yes.
As much as they would like you to think it was a glorious, violent, heroic takeover, the truth seems to be a little more underwhelming. The Bolsheviks just kind of walked into key buildings in the city and took control. Bolsheviks supporting sailors even brought in a huge battleship, but there wasn't really any fighting. Nobody really tried to stop them. In just one day, they took control of the city. Next, Kerensky just managed to escape before the Bolsheviks surrounded the Winter Palace, placing the provisional government under siege inside. Is it safe to come out yet? I think so. Fear my revolutionary might! Give me that. That night, Lenin came out of hiding to play a bigger role in the revolution. With him back at the helm, they had one more job to do: storm the Winter Palace and arrest the provisional government. And here comes the final showdown. The palace was defended by a force known as the Battalion of Death, who immediately gave up. And just like that, Lenin had won. As far as
there was some fighting for the Winter Palace, but one of the units which actually stood its ground and did try and fight the Bolsheviks was a women's battalion. Or I don't know if it was a battalion, but a women's unit which had been formed, and so some of the last people that fought against the Bolshevik takeover were female soldiers. So historical
bloody
curiosity.
revolutionary uprisings go, this wasn't really one of them. But Lenin was finally in charge of Russia. He had spent his whole...
So, I mean, as this video talks about, and there's a kind of debate as to what extent was the Russian Revolution actually a revolution. I mean, I think you could argue it's more of a coup, really. The Bolsheviks never really had popular support. They had a lot of support, and some of their demands were very popular, but they never demonstrated the kind of mass support, as we'll see in the Constitutional Assembly elections. So it was kind of more of a coup, and it was a coup conducted via the Moscow and Petrograd Soviets and other Soviets throughout Russia later on, rather than a kind of genuine popular revolution.
Life dreaming of this moment, he set up the first Council of People's Commissars, his own cabinet with him in charge. This was it, his chance to finally make his communist utopia with equality and freedoms beyond compare. Hey Lenin, before we took power, they were planning on holding elections. Shall we go ahead with those? Of course. You can't have a communist utopia without high levels of political participation. The proletariat should be free to elect to it.
Yes.
What? The social revolutionaries won. We lost. Those don't count. Lenin claimed the elections were unfair and
So, I mean, the socialist revolutionaries did win. The Bolshevik counter-argument was always that by this point a section of the socialist revolutionaries very briefly came to terms with the Bolshevik regime and actually allied with the Bolsheviks. They became known as the left SRs. Now, this was only very brief, and later the Bolsheviks and left SRs fell out again, and it was actually a left SR who very nearly managed to assassinate Lenin then later on during the Civil War. But during this very brief period, the left SRs were allied with the Bolsheviks, but the left SRs weren't represented during the election. So the Bolshevik argument has always been that a lot of the social revolutionary support was from the left SRs who were their allies. But personally, I find that very unconvincing. But I just want to say that in their defence.
The Constituent Assembly they created was counter-revolutionary. He presented the new assembly with a motion that basically said, sign here and give up your power.
Yes.
And when the assembly was like, no, Lenin said, see, they're disobeying me. Proof they're counter-revolutionary. Shut it down, boys. Moderate socialists and others weren't happy when Lenin had the assembly closed by force, and when campaigners began taking to the streets, they were fired upon. For Lenin, setting up a communist utopia was looking
I mean, so one of the key points of the provisional government is that, as we said earlier, it started off being led by Prince Lvov, who was very much not a socialist, and it was dominated by the cadets and sort of a liberal conservative party. Later on, it brought in more and more socialists, but rather than actually enacting the policies that the people wanted, so peace, the requisition of landlords' land, that etc. Essentially, what it did is to discredited the socialists by tying them in with liberal policies. And liberal policies that were becoming really very unpopular with the Russian people. And that's why, for example, the Mensheviks suffered a huge drop in support.
Suspiciously, like setting up a dictatorship. While he was implementing many of the communist policies you'd expect, he was also refusing to work with other political parties and cracking down on opposition. Hey Lenin, are you setting up a dictatorship? I'll shoot you if you are. Of course not. What a crazy theory. Anyway, I'm pleased to announce I'm setting up a secret police force to repress and kill traitors. And by traitors, I of course mean anyone not loyal to me.
Yes.
Owie, 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 owie. The assassination attempt made on Lenin's life in August 1918 failed. But in response, the Bolsheviks ramped up their oppression. But while all of this chaos was...
I mean, whilst the assassination attempt on Lenin failed, he carried the scars of it for the remainder of his life and what was left of his life. And certainly, I mean, we don't know for certain, but a lot of people think that the injuries he sustained there resulted in his earlier death in the early 20s. So, I mean, quite plausibly, I'd say. But I mean, the Russian Civil War, which we're probably going to get onto, was absolutely brutal.
Was erupting back home. Lenin and the boys were also distracted by another problem. They were still at war with the Germans, and they had promised to give the people peace. So Lenin made Trotsky Commissar for Foreign Affairs and sent him off to negotiate a peace deal with the Germans. The Germans offered Trotsky really harsh terms, because they were winning the war. They demanded Russia give up a butt-ton of land, something that would be devastating to the economy. Look, I know it's not great, but I think we have to accept it. Are you insane? This will ruin us. Hey Trotsky, you got a big brain. What do you think? How about no war, no peace? What's that, Mr. Trotsky, sir? It's simple. No war means we'll stop fighting the Germans, but no peace means we won't sign the peace treaty either. Then, when the Germans say we've just stopped fighting, they'll have to leave us alone or something. Yes. Trotsky, that's genius.
I'm sure this is going to go very well.
Do you want me to kiss you? Stop asking me that. Trotsky's no war, no peace plan was a huge success. Oh, wait, no, just kidding. It went exactly as you'd imagine. When the Germans saw the Russians had stopped fighting, they slammed 700,000 troops deep into Russian territory with no resistance. Now, the new peace treaty offered by the Germans was way worse, with Russia losing a huge amount of territory, population, and resources. The Bolsheviks had no choice but to accept, and Russia was humiliated. With Petrograd now in an exposed position, Lenin moved the capital to Moscow, just in case. Things really weren't going well for Lenin, and many people were extremely unhappy with the Bolshevik government and its efforts.
For the treaty the Bolsheviks signed, which was the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, when people complain, I mean, quite rightly, about the harshness of the Treaty of Versailles, the kind of counter-argument is that look what the Germans imposed on Russia, and they probably would have imposed something similar on France and Britain had they won the war in the West as well.
Actions. Lenin, you've pissed off so many people that they've united against you. We're under attack. Relax. We always expected some counter-revolutionary pushback. I think we can handle a few angry monopoly men. But Lenin, it's not just the monopoly men. Okay, who are we up against? Well, the liberals, the social revolutionaries, national separatists in Poland, Finland, the Ukraine, independent warlords setting up chiefdoms, anarchist rebels, the Green Peasant Armies, the Cossacks, the Caucasian states, the Baltic states, the British, the French, the Americans, and the Japanese. Oh, and a legion of Czechoslovakian soldiers seem to have taken over the Trans-Siberian Railway and stolen all the imperial gold reserves. What?
So, I mean, funnily enough, I mean, one of the big reasons why the Bolsheviks were able to win during the Russian Civil War was because the other factions were so divided. I mean, even the White Armies, as they became known, which were basically the nationalist armies, they were very internally divided. But then there was also Green Peasant armies and independent warlords, lots of different nationalist factions trying to set up their own states. It was basically complete chaos, complete carnage. Huge number of people died. And eventually the Bolsheviks were united enough and just about strong enough. They controlled the key bits of Russia with the most industry, but they eventually prevailed. But it was really brutal. And outside powers, including Britain, the United States, France, supported the White Armies, as they became known, which was, as I say, the anti-Bolshevik nationalists, with weapons and in very occasional actually in direct combat as well. Some troops were sent over.
How could this get any worse? Oh, and it says here your mother-in-law is coming to stay. No! A variety of anti-Bolshevik forces had united together to topple Lenin's government, and Russia descended into a full-blown civil war. Now, the Russian Civil War was extremely intricate and would really need its own video, but essentially, the anti-Bolshevik white movement gained control of vast, underdeveloped areas, while the Bolshevik Reds controlled the industrial heartland, using this to their advantage, along with the surprising military genius of Trotsky and the shocking disorganization of...
So that's Trotsky's famous armoured train that was just pictured. Trotsky kind of went around the battlefields on this armoured train and was, basically led the Bolshevik military effort.
The White Army, the fortified
which
Red
Stalin
Army
would try and keep quiet later.
It was an absolutely brutal conflict, with both sides committing horrendous atrocities. To maintain order at home, the Bolsheviks began the Red Terror, and the secret police would execute tens of thousands of suspected traitors. No one was safe from the violence, not even Nicholas himself. You've probably been wondering what Nicholas has been up to this whole time. Well, after his abdication, he and his family were placed under house arrest. At first, they were allowed to live in their usual luxury, but after Lenin took over, their conditions worsened. The Bolsheviks were just holding on to Nick until they could work out what to do with him, but the Civil War complicated things. The last thing they wanted was for Nick to be freed by the White Armies, and so, to stop this from happening...
I mean, that could have been devastating, because one thing the White Armies lacked is one clear leader. I mean, they had lots of different, mostly senior military figures who were leading the various factions, but the coordination between them was terrible. And there was clear divisions within the Whites as to who, if the Whites won, who would actually govern Russia. So if they got their hands on the Tsar, that would have been fantastic for them.
Nicholas's Bolshevik guards decided to act. It's not entirely certain whether Lenin ordered it, or if the guards were acting on their own volition. But on July 17th, 1918, with White armies approaching, they woke Nicholas and his family in the middle of the night and brought them into the basement. There, a drunken squad of Bolsheviks murdered the entire family. Nicholas, the last...
I mean, it's very sad. I mean, they've been denied sanctuary in quite a number of countries, but including the UK, because the British government was concerned that giving sanctuary to them would infuriate work opinion in the UK and kind of lead to more radicalisation in Britain, even though the British king wanted them to get sanctuary.
Tsar, once one of the most powerful men alive, had met a brutal end. But after years of fighting and millions of deaths, Trotsky and his Red Army came out victorious. Wow, that was a close one. Okay, back to creating a communist utopia. How are we doing on that? Well, the Civil War helped create a massive famine and about 5 million people starved to death. There's massive inflation and the ruble is worthless. Hundreds and hundreds of kilometers of railway track have been destroyed. Disease and epidemics have killed 3 million. The population of Moscow and Petrograd has collapsed. Life expectancies...
And so that's a really crucial point. The population of the big cities collapsed. And that was the Bolsheviks' original base of support. I mean, the industrial workers. And there were a lot less industrial workers by the end of the Civil War, partly because they were... They formed such a big part of the Bolshevik armies. So, I mean, the Bolsheviks were claiming to rule on behalf of the workers, but by 1923, there weren't many workers left at all. And once the Bolsheviks didn't have their kind of social base of support, all they had really left was terror.
Plummeted. Sailors in Kronstadt are rebelling, people are freezing to death in their own apartments, and life has been reduced to a constant search for food and shelter. Whoa. Well, this just means I'll have to work twice as hard, day and night, to save the country. Nothing will stop me, short of a couple of sudden strokes. Get the doctor. One thing you have to keep in mind is that everything I've been talking about, the Civil War, the assassination attempt, and Lenin's struggle to maintain control at home, were all happening around the same time, and it must have been extremely stressful. Lenin began getting headaches, insomnia, and in 1922, he suffered 2 separate strokes. As the Soviet Union was officially declared under a strict one-party system, Lenin's health continued to decline, and his ability to lead the Communist Party went with it. Everybody assumed Trotsky would succeed him. He was a great speaker, he'd won the Civil War, and he had a dope-ass train. The last person anyone expected to take over was Stalin. Stalin wasn't a great intellectual like Lenin, or a charismatic war hero like Trotsky. He was, as one Menshevik described him, a grey blur. Someone who operated in the background. Someone who you might not even notice. But it was in the background that Stalin would rise to power. Here's how it happened. After the revolution, all the Bolsheviks hoped to get a cool job in the new government. What did you get? Commissar for War. Sweet! What'd you get? Secretary. Stalin was made general secretary for the Communist Party. It wasn't what he wanted, but Stalin quickly realized that even though it wasn't fancy, it was a powerful position. As secretary, he had the power to give people jobs within the party, so he would give jobs to all of his pals, who in turn would give him their support. The more pals he gave jobs, the more power he got. The more power he got, the more pals he got. Lenin may have been having wall-to-wall strokes, but he was still involved in the party, and he was taking notice. He wasn't a fan of Stalin abusing his position, or insulting his wife to her face. Lenin knew he couldn't let Stalin take over.
Exactly happened. Oh, it might have been on the phone, I'm not sure. It was either to her face or on the phone.
He's just too sick to fight it. Hey man, tell whoever's in charge of giving people jobs not to let that jerk Stalin become the next leader. By the way, who did I put in charge of giving people jobs? That would be Stalin, sir.
Yes.
Well, déjà vu. Lenin's last wish was to not let Stalin take over, but by the time he died, Stalin was too powerful to remove. He had his remaining opponents
I mean, Lenin wrote there was a kind of a final will and testimony, part of which was a warning about Stalin, but Stalin very successfully managed to get that suppressed after Lenin actually died. And as this says, it kind of there were a whole series of battles. So they fought against what called the left deviation, the right deviation. So that was Kamenev, Zinoviev, Bukharin, all of whom were executed. Trotsky was eventually killed by an assassin. So, and it got very brutal.
Arrested or killed. Trotsky was banished and fled to Europe. Eventually, he would be assassinated by Soviet spies in 1940. Our dear comrade Lenin
that was
has
in Mexico.
died. We should have a state funeral. No. Let's mummify him and put him on display so people can look at his dead body forever. That's gross. You're gross. Guards, kill him. Lenin had waited so long to take control in Russia, but he never got to see his communist utopia. His short time in charge was spent dealing with the destroyed Russian economy, World War I, and the Civil War. He was cruel and merciless, but he really did seem to believe communism...
He looks really tiny in that. I mean, I suppose that's like right at the end of his life, but he looks tiny, like kind of little withered, withering away.
...would make Russia a better place. Stalin, on the other hand, would take the Soviet Union down a different path.
Yes.
If you thought Lenin was a tyrant, well, you ain't seen nothing yet, girl. A secret police state, a rapidly militarizing superpower, led by a paranoid man who deeply distrusted the West, would see the world come to the brink of nuclear annihilation. That's right, I'm talking about...
Cold War.
Remember to click the link.
Well, so that was a very interesting summary, I thought. A very good summary. For 20 minutes, it packed a lot of stuff in there. As I say, I mean, you could easily have a video on the Russian Civil War alone, and I'd love there to be one. Perhaps I'll look for one. Perhaps I might even try and make a video sometime. But if you made it this far, you are legends amongst men and women. So huge thank you, and I hope to see you in the next video. And all the usual like, subscribe, like, all that stuff that YouTubers normally say. Do that. But yeah, no, thanks a lot.